Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. There are doors in history that no one opens not because they are hidden, because they were never meant to be noticed in the first place. At the very center of Akhenaten modern, Amarna stood a temple unlike any other in Egyptian memory. It had no darkness, no hidden chamber, no god resting in a shrine, no closed doors, except, perhaps, for one. If you walk through the ruins of the great Aten temple today, what you'll see is a flat sprawl of low foundations, the stone mostly plundered or collapsed. But if you look closely, especially in the sanctuary at its court, you'll see a section of brickwork where no official door appears in the plans, a false wall, sealed from the inside. It's been called many things: a storeroom, a misaligned wall, a flaw in construction. But in 1892, during a quiet dig season that never made the front pages, a team of local workers, following a series of underground channels, found what appeared to be an inner chamber tucked behind this wall, bricked in so tightly that even the seams vanished. They called it Akhenaten, a quiet place with a face. It was never opened. The wall was mapped, photographed, left alone, because the excavators later wrote it didn't belong, not to the structure, not to the logic of temple plans, not even to the theology of Aten, the faceless sun god whom Akhenaten had elevated above all others. And so it remains technically documented, functionally erased. But if we are to understand Akhenaten, not the painted version, not the ruined one, but the human, we must ask what he locked behind that door. Because this wasn't an ordinary pharaoh, and this wasn't an ordinary room. Akhenaten was born Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. His early life was quiet, perhaps even unremarkable, tucked in the background of one of Egypt's most successful reigns. But around the 5th year of his kingship, something changed. He began moving everything: his court, his gods, his art, his rituals, away from Thebes, and in the vast heat-flattened land halfway between Memphis and Thebes, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. The entire capital was laid out according to celestial calculations. Temples were built with no roofs, everything open to the sky. And the Akhenaten was not shown as a human figure, but as a sun disk reaching down in rays that ended in hands. But in the midst of this open-air theology, this erasure of darkness and enclosure, Akhenaten built a hidden chamber. He left no record of it, and that silence may be the loudest thing he ever wrote. It's important to understand the shape of his new theology. Traditional Egyptian religion revolved around hiddenness. Gods emerged from darkness. Temples moved from light to shadow. Priests whispered names that were never written. Akhenaten inverted all of it. He eliminated all other deities. He wiped names off walls. He chiseled out Amen, Mut, Khonsu, even Thoth. He even banned images of himself and his family from being depicted in shadow. And he did something no other pharaoh had done. He refused to be buried in the Valley of the Kings. Instead, he had his tomb cut into the cliffs near Amarna, a different place, a new ritual, a rejection of the entire tradition of Osiris and the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. But here's where it gets strange. In the records of court rituals from year 8 of his reign, a quiet line appears. His Majesty withdrew from the gaze. He sat within the breath, alone. No one knows what this means, but soon after, something shifted. The king stopped appearing at public ceremonies. His sculptors began making him thinner. His family was less visible. One daughter died, then another. And the temple, once full of open-air processions and light-washed altars, fell silent. By year 12, inscriptions stopped. No new hymns, no new prayers, only quiet and a sealed brick wall behind the sanctuary. What do we make of that room? Ontologists have speculated for more than a century. Some say it was a crypto, the religion rejected burial. Others suggest it was a private shrine, though no gods were permitted to be shown in form. A few propose it was nothing at all, just a structural compromise, space between walls. But among the oldest workers at Amarna, there's another phrase passed down in stories: the king's ear room, a place where Akhenaten, now refusing court life, would sit in silence, listening, not speaking, not writing, just listening. To what? To Aten, to the voices of his lost daughters, to a god that offered only heat and withdrawal. We don't know, but when the next dynasty came to Tutankhamun, Horemheb, they ordered the temples of Aten dismantled brick by brick, and yet that room, that bricked-in chamber behind the altar, was left sealed, not reused, not entered, just left a door with no key, a wall with no name. Perhaps even the destroyers of Akhenaten's world didn't dare open it. There's a term in ancient Egyptian architecture, Perset, the house of silence. It referred to boundary markers around shrines, lines that could not be crossed, not because of traps or guardians, but because of stillness. That chamber at Amarna, the room behind the altar, never marked, never entered, may have been his final set. Not a room for death, not for memory, just for being forgotten. But then again, we remember it, even now, dusty, cracked, untouched. It lingers. It was never opened. And so, the question remains, what did Akhenaten lock behind the wall that should not have existed? The city of Akhenaten was meant to be a clean slate, a city without shadows, a city without memory, a city without god sex, for one, built in haste and at great cost. It was more than a relocation. It was a rejection. Everything Akhenaten inherited: the temples of Thebes, the priesthoods of Ammon, the rituals of Osiris, he refused. And when he walked away from them, he tried to make sure the world walked with him. But even the cleanest slate gathers dust, and even a god of light needs a place to hide. Let's step back for a moment and consider the broader purpose of Akhenaten's project, not just the theological change, but the administrative one. The royal court, the scribal schools, and even the artists who once carved in deep relief were brought to Akhenaten and retrained. Their new brief was strict: show no darkness, use no old names, depict the king in intimate scenes with his family, or in worship before the sun disk. Temples were to be roofless, sanctuaries open to the sun. Priests were no longer required to maintain a god statue, because Aten had no form. There was no cold statue, no ceremonial washing, no perfume, no food offerings placed in front of an idol. The Aten was everywhere and nowhere at once. But then, what were the inner rooms for? In the great temple at Akhenaten, there are architectural remnants of chambers that serve no liturgical function in Netennism. Rooms with walls, but no inscriptions. Smooth floors, but no altars. Closed corners with no threshold. One chamber, in particular, the sealed one behind the sanctuary, does not appear in any surviving temple plans. It's not part of the official floor layout that was later chiseled into nearby boundary stele. It's not listed among the rooms for offering preparation or sun-focused ceremonies. And yet, someone built it, and someone sealed it. We know from various surviving inventories that the court in Amarna was meticulously organized. Even the number of bread loaves baked daily for temple staff was recorded. But this room, this anomaly, is missing from every line item, every account. That doesn't mean it was forgotten. It means it was deliberately excluded. It's rare in Egyptian history for anything royal to be left undocumented. Bureaucracy was the spine of the state. Grain counted, beer recorded, labor tallied, but silence, in this case, appears intentional. The brickwork was so carefully done that its seam was nearly invisible, and it was bricked from inside the sanctuary wall, which means whoever sealed it was not a laborer working from outside the structure, they were within. There's one surviving papyrus fragment damaged, faint, and found miles away in what was once the scribe's quarter that mentions a ritual unlike any other in Akhenaten's court. It describes not a public ceremony, but a private moment. His Majesty sat alone beneath the rays. No food was brought. No words were spoken. The door closed behind the fourth hour. Nothing more, no name of the chamber, no context, no explanation. But the use of the fourth hour is intriguing. In Egyptian thought, the day was divided into hours based on the sun's arc. The fourth hour corresponded to mid-morninger time when the sun's heat became fully felt, but shadows were still present. A moment of transition in typical solar worship. This hour was associated with the balance between day's rise and the beginning of its descent. To sit in silence during that hour, in a sealed room with no food and no words, it was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of withdrawal. It may be that the chamber behind the altar was Akhenaten's personal space of renunciation, not a place to speak to Aten, but a place to let go of everything else. His court, his family, perhaps even himself. There is evidence that during the final years of his reign, Akhenaten was increasingly isolated. After year 12, his appearances in public reliefs become scarce. The Amarna letters, diplomatic tablets sent from vassals in Syria and Canaan go unanswered. Foreign rulers write urgently, asking where Egypt's king has gone. One clay tablet from a prince of Byblus reads, "We send gold and receive silence." Where is the son of the sun? Where does he dwell? Within Egypt, something else began to change. A new name appeared beside the kings in records. Sminker, a ruler, a co-regent, a son-in-law, a double. We don't know. What we do know is that in those final years, Akhenaten disappeared from the center of the kingdom he built. His inscriptions stopped. His daughters vanished one by one, and the worship of Aten grew quieter. Did he retreat into that sealed room? The one with no name, no decoration, no echo? It's possible. A clue lies in a set of plaster fragments found in 1923 near the small Aten temple. It's just a few hundred meters from the great temple's core. Among them were broken pieces of a scene never fully reconstructed. It showed the king kneeling alone, not with his family, not before a shrine, but within what appeared to be a plain, enclosed space. The only adornment was the disk of the sun reaching down toward him, with no hands, no rays, just light, unshaped, unreaching. A god not offering anything, just watching. Some scholars believe this scene depicts Akhenaten's own final withdrawal, not a death, not an abdication, but a disappearance into solitude. And the chamber bricked in from the inside, undocumented, undescribed, was the door he passed through. But then, if that room held the king himself, why wasn't it desecrated after his death? Why wasn't it broken apart by those who followed him, by Horemheb, who erased his name, or by Ramses, who took the stone for his own temples? Perhaps no one knew where it was, or perhaps those who knew chose not to touch it. Egyptians were masters of desecration. They knew how to erase names, to chisel out eyes, to punish the dead. But they also knew the weight of sacred silence. And if Akhenaten had truly built a room not to glorify himself, but to disappear, then maybe that was respected, feared, keyed, even because here was a king who rewrote the very nature of God, who destroyed the temples of every other deity, who said that no image was holy, and then who sat in silence, alone, sealed himself away. To leave that room untouched may have been less about reverence and more about caution, a kind of architectural exile. They erased his city, but they did not break his silence. There's an ancient Egyptian phrase, per-ka, often translated as the house of the soul. It referred to the tomb, the place where the vital essence could dwell after death. But some records describe a per-ka not as a tomb, but as a chamber inside Temple Zen, interior space where memory or divine force could settle, not for the living, not even for worship, just for rest. Perhaps that's what this chamber was, a resting place for a king who had no tomb, for a God with no face, for a silence that could not be erased. But that chamber is still there, sealed, unentered, and we are left with only the outside, the outline. The question, what did Akhenaten place behind the altar? A room with no name, no images, no instructions, a body, a prayer, or nothing at all, nothing at all. There is a quiet kind of endurance in things that are never opened. Rooms with no footprints, walls with no inscriptions, doorways that were never meant to swing wide. History tends to speak through grand axe wars, coronations, inventions, but sometimes its deepest voice echoes in what is left untouched by the end of Akhenaten's reign. The once radiant city of Akhenaten was already beginning to fall still. Sunlight still washed across the columned courts, but the people were fewer. The administrative quarter still issued grain tallies, but correspondence from foreign lands arrived unanswered. And though the great temple still stood at the city's heart, the ceremonies had lost their rhythm. No one knows the exact year Akhenaten died. There was no state funeral, no grand stealer, no ceremonial transition of power. When his name disappears from the record, it is not replaced with a line of mourning, but with a silence that stretches like desert between dynasties and that sealed chamber. The quiet anomaly behind the altar of Aten was never mentioned again in the centuries that followed. The memory of Akhenaten itself began to fade. Later, pharaohs wanted to forget it. The Aten temples were dismantled, their sun-baked talatat bricks hauled off to Thebes and Memphis, reused in new temples as filler stone, hidden inside the walls of places devoted once again to Amen, Osiris, Ptah, and the old gods. Reliefs of Akhenaten were chiseled down, names erased, titles removed, and the city disappeared under dust and time. But one chamber, behind one wall, survived not because it was strong, but because no one saw it, or chose not to see it. The final act of Akhenaten's spiritual rebellion was not thunderous. It was brick, sealed door in the back of a temple no one would pray in again, a room that bore no image and offered no clue, a vanishing, and in that vanishing, a kind of endurance. But what, exactly, might have been in there? Archaeologists have debated this for over a century. Some believe the room may have held the king's private altar, something that Atenists rejected publicly, but that Akhenaten may have kept in secret. Others believe it was a storehouse for forbidden images, perhaps even relics of the old gods that Akhenaten had once worshipped before his radical shift, that, for all his proclamations, was not untouched by the weight of tradition. Still others suggest it was a form of tomb, not for his body, but for his memory. Not a burial chamber, but a removal from history, a final offering to a God who gave no afterlife, who offered no field of reeds, no judgment scene, no promise of rebirth. Aten, as worshipped by Akhenaten, was a god of the moment here, the now, the present sunlight on the skin. When the light faded, there was nothing more. And perhaps that chamber was meant to be the architectural expression of that philosophy. No resurrection, no transformation, just absence. And yet, curiously, Akhenaten's body was never found. Some believe it was hidden in Tomb 26, a tomb at Amarna that appears to have been desecrated in antiquity. Others argue his mummy was discovered in KV 55's, the no infamous mystery tomb in the Valley of the Kings, whose occupant was buried hastily, the name scratched out, the remains poorly preserved. But even if KV 55 holds his bones, it tells us nothing of his mind that lies, perhaps, in the sealed chamber, a space that more than any tomb or temple reflects how Akhenaten wanted to vanish, not die, but disappear. Centuries later, during the 19th dynasty, scribes under Seti and Ramses II were tasked with reviewing and restoring the history of kings, but Akhenaten's name rarely appears in these recompiled lists. When it does, it is often as a blank, a skipped number, a deliberate omission. Some lists call him the enemy. Others do not mention him at all. And still, the sealed chamber remained, unclaimed, unpillaged, undisturbed, for all the power of those later kings, for all their monuments and inscriptions. They never found that room, or if they did, they left it. And that may be the most remarkable thing of all. There's something uncomfortable about silence. Human instinct is to fill it with sound, with motion, with memory. But silence is also a form of communication, especially when built in stone. A sealed room behind an altar in a city that was erased. It was not sealed because it was forgotten. It was sealed because it was meant to be unfound. A kind of monument, not to Akhenaten's reign, but to his refusal. His refusal of the old gods, the afterlife, the dynasty's traditions, even perhaps of himself. You can imagine him then, withdrawn, surrounded by nothing but light, sitting in a plain room. No murals, no incense, no one chanting, no name carved into the wall, just the sun filtered through silence. A room designed not to glorify, but to vanish. And it worked, because 3,000 years later, all we have is the outline of the wall. No inscriptions, no labels, no records, just a space where something once was. The world has often tried to classify Akhenaten, heretic, revolutionary, madman, prophet. But each label tells us more about the modern mind than the ancient one. He left no manifesto, no explanation, just bricks, names chiseled off, prayers rewritten in one sealed room that no one can explain. Perhaps that's what he wanted. Not worship, not memory, just withdrawal, a permanent retreat, not from the world, but from meaning itself. In a poetic sense, we've all inherited his room. There are sealed chambers in every life, places in our memory we never re-enter. Moments built over with silence, walls constructed brick by brick, not to imprison, but to protect something no longer needed, or too fragile to face again. The sealed chamber behind Akhenaten's altar may have been Egypt's first true monument to erasure. Not destruction, not rebellion, just absence. And in that absence, a strange kind of legacy. A whisper made of stone, a shadow beneath the sun, a door behind an altar, never meant to open, The Valley of the Kings is full of names, keyed in limestone, painted in ochre, carved in haste or in splendor. Each tomb is a declaration, a statement of identity, of lineage, of death and resurrection. But there is one door in that valley that says nothing, just a faint plaster seal. No Cartouche, no prayer, no promise of rebirth, only absence. They called it KV 55, the 55th tomb cataloged in the King's Valley. And when it was opened in 1907, what lay inside would ignite over a century of speculation, silence, confusion, and scholarly unrest. Not because it was filled with treasure. It wasn't. Not because it was cursed. It didn't need to be. But because everything inside it, every trace of wood, gold, bone, dust, and faded ink seemed to whisper a name. and no one could agree on which one. It began with a sloping corridor, half choked by rubble and bats. The excavators were led by Theodore Davis, an American millionaire turned amateur Egyptologist. He had already overseen the clearance of more than a dozen tombs, growing increasingly impatient with each underwhelming find. Cute, the valley, he insisted in a published pamphlet, had been exhausted. There was nothing left to discover. He was wrong. KV-55 was unlike anything his team had encountered. When they cleared the entrance and stepped inside, they found a single chamber. No elaborate corridors, no nested shrines, just one square room, its walls undecorated, its ceiling low and coarse, and in the middle a decayed coffin, blackened by time, stripped of gold, its inscriptions erased with violent intent. Inside, a skeleton. At first glance, it seemed an ordinary burial, if such a thing exists in a royal necropolis. But quickly, contradictions began to pile up. The wooden coffin, now cracked and scorched by age, had clearly once been gilded and ornate, but the gold leaf had been peeled away, and the hieroglyphs, defaced, where once a king's name had been proudly inscribed. There was only a gouged-out oval, yet one fragment of gold foil, missed by the ancient erasers, still bore a trace of a royal epithet, beloved of Aten, that narrowed things down. Only a handful of rulers in all of Egyptian history ever identified themselves with Aten. The singular sun disk, elevated by Akhenaten above all other gods, which meant the body inside this coffin likely came from one moment in time, the brief, unstable decades of the Amarna period. But which figure? Akhenaten, Smenkhare, a mysterious prince, or someone else entirely? The room offered no easy answers. Around the coffin lay disjointed artifacts, some rich, some ruined, all confusing. A dismantled gilded shrine, its panels bearing the image of Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother, a set of magical bricks, funerary tools meant to protect the deceased in the afterlife, scribed with Akhenaten's own throne name, canopic jars shaped like a woman's head, perhaps Queen Kia or even Tai herself, and then the floor debris, animal bones, resin stains, shattered pottery, a small gold-plated uraeus, the serpent emblem of divine kingship, broken from a crown. Each piece was a whisper from a different direction. Each voice contradicted the others. One tomb, too many stories, no clear owner. The body, thin, fragile, and incomplete, presented yet another riddle. Examiners noted the poor condition of the bones, warped by water damage and time. The skull was elongated, the teeth youthful. The sternum was missing. There was no pelvis. The arms had been crossed in the royal pose. But the age sparked decades of debate. Initial assessments suggested a young man, no more than 20. But if that was true, it couldn't be Akhenaten, who ruled for 17 years and fathered multiple children. Nor could it be the elderly Queen Tai, whose presence was suggested by the shrine. Later forensic studies, using radiology and modern techniques, pushed the age higher, perhaps 35, perhaps more. Yet, every examination produced a different estimate, and none could confirm the identity. It was a royal burial, erased, not neglected, not lost, but deliberately obscured, which left a new kind of question. Why would anyone go to the trouble of burying a pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings, only to erase every trace of who they were? We don't often think of history as being careful, but this tomb, this silent, scraped-down chamber, was nothing if not calculated. The coffin was royal, but vandalized. The shrine was magnificent, but out of place. The jars were sacred, but misgendered. This was not a proper burial. It was an afterthought, perhaps keeping a political compromise. We know that after Akhenaten's death, Egypt entered a strange and delicate phase. His successor, a figure named Smenkhare, reigned briefly, perhaps as a core ruler, Then came the child king Tutankhamun, who changed his name to Tutankhamun, restored the old gods, to abandon Akhenaten altogether in this chaotic shuffle. Akhenaten's legacy was first tolerated, then erased. His statues were smashed, his temples dismantled, his name scratched from history. But what do you do with his body? Leave it exposed? Destroy it? Or quietly hide it? Some believe KV-55s is the answer to that question. Not a burial, but a disposal, a temporary interment, a way to tuck the past out of sight without risking the god's wrath. No mourning, no tribute, just brick, dust, and silence. Yet, for all the anonymity of KV-55, it refused to stay silent. Every scholar who entered its low chamber came out, changed, uncertain, intrigued, full of contradiction. DNA analysis, done decades later, offered fresh clues. The skeleton in KV-55, it turned out, shared genetic markers with the famous Tutankhamun. In fact, the match was nearly perfect for a father-son relationship. And if that's true, then the nameless body, broken and burned, belonged to Akhenaten, buried alone, without fanfare, without ceremony, with his name torn away. That would make KV-55 the most undignified burial of a pharaoh ever found, a god on earth, tucked into the back of the valley like a mistake. But the room still whispers. The plaster on the doorway, for example, had once held a seal, and not just any seal, the oval mark of the royal necropolis. But unlike other tombs, KV-55's seal was never renewed, never touched up. It was placed once, then left to fade. No priests came to tend it. No officials visited. No prayers were recited. It was a burial without afterlife, a door meant to stay shut. And yet, someone went to the trouble to build it too. Carry the body there, to furnish it, however confusedly, with gold and jars and bricks. This was no casual dumping ground. It was deliberate, which leads us to one final, comfortable question. What if KV-55 isn't about honoring the dead at all? What if it's about containing them? The silence in KV-55 wasn't accidental. It was engineered, as if the tomb itself was trying to say, this didn't happen. This wasn't supposed to be. Forget it. Stone remembers things people forget. And in the valley of the kings, where even the smallest chip of limestone can outlive empires, KV-55 stands not as a resting place, but as a compromise. Let's imagine Egypt, around 1336 BCE, the years following the collapse of Akhenaten's reign. The capital, city of Akhenaten, is emptying. Court officials pack in silence. Priests walk again under the banners of Ammon. The Aten temples are left to the wind. And Akhenaten, the heretic king, the radical who defied 2,000 years of belief, has died. But his body, it still exists. And that's the problem. There's a dilemma in every regime change. What do you do with the body of the old order? To destroy it would be heresy. Even Akhenaten, with all his defiance, was still a pharaoh. The ancient rituals demanded that he be buried, mummified, protected, at least in form. But to honor him, to gild his tomb, recite his name, invoke his divinity, that was politically impossible. So his body was moved, not celebrated, not even truly buried, just hidden. And this is the most persistent theory about KV-55, that it is not a burial at all, but a relocation. A hasty, unsanctioned transfer, a way to put a problem underground. We believe Akhenaten was originally buried in the royal tomb of Akhenaten, a vast, unfinished cavern carved into the cliffs near his capital city. Inscriptions there suggest his daughters were laid to rest in nearby chambers. One corridor, heavily damaged, may have once held his sarcophagus, but when the city fell, the tomb became a liability. You couldn't leave the body there. Tomb robbers would find it. Priests of Ammon might desecrate it, Worse, sympathetic followers might start building a cult around it. That couldn't be allowed. So someone, perhaps Tutankhamun's officials, perhaps even I or Horemheb, quietly reburied the king, not in Thebes, not in glory, but in a low, unmarked tomb on the edge of the valley, KV55. If this is true, it would explain the tomb's strange contradictions. The presence of Queen Ti's shrine, for instance. Ti, Akhenaten's mother, was a towering figure in royal life, respected across multiple reigns. Her image on a golden shrine would not have been placed there lightly. Some scholars suggest her body was also moved at the same time, but no remains matching her profile have been found in KV55. So perhaps the shrine was brought not to house her, but to shield him, to give the tomb a kind of legitimacy. A mother watching over her son, a matriarch cloaking her child's memory in royal respectability, and the funerary bricks bearing Akhenaten's name, a quiet signature tucked into the shadows, perhaps included by a scribe who still revered the fallen king, or a priest who feared the consequences of an improper burial. Either way, bricks were placed where no one would see them. They weren't there to glorify. They were there to satisfy the gods. Then there's the coffin itself. When it was found in 1907, the wood was rotting. The gold leaf had peeled away. What traces of the original decoration remained, enough to reconstruct what it once looked like. It was a royal coffin, designed for a king, but it had been altered. The names had been scraped off. The uraeus, the cobra symbol of pharaonic divinity, had been broken from the forehead. The faceplate was missing, and the cartouches had been hacked so thoroughly that only fragments survived. Whoever did this, did not act in haste. They knew what they were erasing. This wasn't looting. It wasn't time or decay. It was policy. Someone had decided that the person inside this coffin did not deserve the honor of being remembered. Not just killed, not just buried, but scrubbed out. And yet, the coffin was still used. That's the contradiction at the heart of KV55. Every object in the tomb was royal, yet compromised. The shrine was magnificent, but perhaps not meant for the buried individual. The jars were beautiful, but bore the wrong gender. The coffin was regal, but desecrated. And the body, a king, a father, a political liability, a man whose religious vision had shaken Egypt, and left it fractured. And yet, his bones were laid carefully, crossed, arms mummified, though poorly placed in a chamber that, though bare, was still sealed with sacred plaster. We know that ancient Egyptians believed deeply in the power of ritual. Even after the end of the Amarna period, even after Akhenaten's revolution was rolled back, there remained a sense of cosmic obligation, a fear of what might happen if a pharaoh's body was left unburied, if his name was left unspoken. So KV55 may have been an act of fear, not of devotion. Bury him, not to honor him, but to prevent him from haunting the living God. This was not a tomb, it was a containment unit, but not everyone agreed. In the decades following its discovery, KV55 became the subject of endless academic debate. Who was in the coffin? Some said Smenkhare, a shadowy curler who briefly followed Akhenaten. Others suggested Ti, despite the skeleton's male characteristics. And still others argued for Akhenaten himself, citing the DNA links to Tutankhamun. Each theory had flaws. The bones were damaged, the inscriptions destroyed, the artifacts contradictory. But maybe that was the point. Maybe KV55 wasn't meant to answer anything. Maybe it was built to hide questions, to seal them under stone, to bury confusion in dust. It's no accident that the tomb lay undisturbed for over 3,000 years. The Valley of the Kings was looted heavily in antiquity. Almost every tomb was broken into, gold stolen, mummies burned, furniture ransacked, but KV55 remained intact because no one wanted what it held. Even tomb robbers, desperate men who would pry gold leaf from a toenail, avoided it. There was no treasure, no beauty, no glory, just the quiet shame of an erased king. A body that didn't belong, a name that had no place on a wall. When the coffin was finally opened in the modern era, it had been lying in that low room for more than 3 millennia. The wood, warped by time. The bandages, soaked in ancient resin. The face, long gone. There was no ceremony, no procession, just a few archaeologists blinking in the dry heat, and a king who had not been mourned, not properly, not loudly, but perhaps somewhere in the quiet of the valley, someone had whispered a prayer. A laborer, a scribe, a forgotten priest, a single name spoken into stone, one final time. And now, that body, the body from KV 55, lies in the Egyptian museum, labeled carefully, examined often, still questioned, still unresolved. Was it Akhenaten? Was it Smenkhare? Was it someone else entirely? Perhaps, more importantly, did it matter? Maybe. The real story isn't about identity. Maybe it's about what happens when identity is erased, when a legacy becomes a liability, when a burial becomes a burial of truth itself. There are 2 ways to erase someone from history. The first is physical. You destroy their statues. You scratch their names off walls. You burn their scrolls. You melt their seals. You bury them without inscription. You lock them in a room no one is meant to enter again. The second is subtler. You confuse their story. You blur the facts. You leave behind conflicting symbols. You allow only whispers, never clarity. You make it so no one is ever quite sure who they were. Were they a king? A villain? A mistake? KV 55, the nameless tomb in the Valley of the Kings, is a case of both. It is an erasure, but it is also a fog, and in many ways, that fog has only thickened with time. We return now to the bones. The man who lay inside the coffin, whoever he was not at peace, at least not in the traditional sense. The position of the body was royal, arms crossed, the posture of kingship, but the preservation was poor. The embalmers had used an excess of resin, which soaked the wrappings and likely hastened decomposition. The skull showed damage. The teeth had been poorly cared for. He was not mummified with love, not like Seti I, whose mummy was discovered beautifully preserved, not like Ramses II, his golden skin and intact curls. The man from KV 55 was treated as a requirement, not a remembrance. It was as though the embalmers were saying, this has to be done. But no more than that. In the 21st century, Egyptian authorities authorized new testing. The Supreme Council of Antiquities, led by Zahi Hawass, launched a major genetic study between 2007 and 2010. Their goal, to unravel the family tree of Tutankhamun and, if possible, identify the KV 55 mummy once and for all. The results? A stunning match. DNA revealed that the KV 55 skeleton was the father of Tutankhamun. It also showed that the KV 55 individual was the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. Only one person fits both roles, Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. The first and only ruler to reject Egypt's millennial pantheon and elevate a single god, Aten, the solar disk. A king whose reign appended art, language, worship, and politics. A man whose name was later so thoroughly erased that we almost didn't know he existed until now. The skeleton, the broken shrine, the mismatched jars, the hacked coffin, they all point to him, but the confirmation only deepened the mystery. Why was Akhenaten buried like this? Why in KV 55, an unfinished, featureless chamber? Why with Queen Tai's shrine, but not hers? Why in a coffin designed for someone else, later modified, then vandalized. And most of all, why wasn't he reburied? Later, during the reign of his son, Tutankhamun restored the old religion. He reopened the temples of Amun. He issued proclamations condemning his father's religious innovations. But surely, as a son, he would have remembered him. Surely, there could have been some gesture, some token of reconciliation, a better tomb, a new coffin, a priestly rite, and yet, nothing, unless Tutankhamun never knew. Tutankhamun became pharaoh at around 9 years old. He was a child in the hands of regents like Lehi and Horemheb, powerful courtiers who steered the kingdom back toward tradition. His name was changed, his identity was shaped, his memory of his father, if he had any, was likely controlled, which means the decision to erase Akhenaten may not have come from anger, or even ideology. It may have been pragmatic. Egypt needed stability. It needed to forget. So Akhenaten, the most radical king in its history, became a problem to be filed away. Hence, KV55, not a tomb, a filing cabinet. It's hard for us today to grasp the significance of name erasure in ancient Egypt. To the Egyptians, name was more than identification. It was immortality. You lived in the afterlife only so long as your name was remembered. Statues, inscriptions, prayers, these were not honors. They were life support systems for the dead. To erase a name was to kill someone twice, first in body, then in eternity. So when Akhenaten's name was chiseled out of his coffin, when his cartouches were hacked from his funerary bricks, it wasn't just defacement, it was execution. But it didn't work, because we remember him. We remember the odd-faced statues, the androgynous depictions. It's a strange city of Akhenaten, where temples had no roofs, so the sun could touch the altar. The hymn to the Aten, a prayer unlike anything written before or since. And we remembered the tomb with no name, the coffin with no face, the room no one was supposed to find, and the man whose bones still seemed to radiate confusion. There is another layer to this story, one not always discussed in archaeology books. It is the psychological toll of ambiguity. For over a century, scholars, writers, artists, and ordinary readers have puzzled over KV55. Books have been written, lectures delivered, documentaries aired. Each new theory proposes a kind of closure. This was Akhenaten. No, this was Smenkare. No, it was a ceremonial burial only. But none of them satisfy, because KV55 doesn't behave like a story. It behaves like a question, one sealed in stone. What if that's the point? What if KV55 isn't a failure of burial, but a success of intention, a design to always be unclear? Consider, the tomb had no wall decorations, no formal inscriptions, no funerary texts. The chamber was cut hastily, left unpainted, half finished. The coffin bore a royal shape, but was scratched out. The mummy was royal, but unnamed. The shrine invoked Tai, but Tai was not there. It's a puzzle box where every piece misleads. It's not an answer. It's a trap for questions. And maybe that's how you truly erase someone, not by burying them in obscurity, but by burying them in so much confusion that the truth never quite emerges. In the Egyptian Museum today, the bones of the KV55 mummy lie under controlled lighting behind reinforced glass. Visitors walk by, some linger, most don't. The label says, likely Akhenaten. That likely carries a century of uncertainty, but it also carries a kind of poetry, because in that word, likely, is all the tension, the memory. We think we know, we want to know, we almost know, but we never fully do. And that is how history sometimes survives, not through clarity, but through persistence, not through triumph, but through a door sealed in the desert, a coffin stripped of gold, a shrine missing its queen, and a man who ruled the kingdom, changed its gods, raised a city, loved a son, and was then wrapped in resin, silenced, hidden in the lowest tomb in the valley, not to be honored, but to be forgotten. Yet, here you are, lying in bed, wondering about him, listening, asking, remembering. And maybe that's the one thing his erasers didn't plan for, that forgetting someone can make people curious, and curiosity, is its own kind of immortality. When you picture ancient Egypt, you might imagine pyramids that took decades to build, temples carved into rock with mathematical precision, tombs layered in art, inked with prayers and maps for the soul's journey. But Amarna wasn't built like that. It wasn't meant to last. It was a city born in defiance and assembled with urgency, like something being scribbled faster than it could dry, and under its sand. Centuries later, archaeologists would find something strange. Not treasure, not bodies, not gold, but tablets, just clay tablets, forgotten and buried beneath the floor. It is, arguably, one of the most important paper trails ever left behind. And no one meant for it to survive, but it did. And it tells us everything, not through stories of kings, but through administrative notes, complaints, and internal confusion. This is the story of the Amarna letters, and the hidden archive of a city that was never supposed to leave a mark. Didn't exist until Akhenaten invented it in the 5th year of his reign. The pharaoh, formerly known as Amenhotep IV, abandoned Thebes, the sacred seat of Amun, god of kings and kings of gods, and declared a new capital city. He called it Akhenaten. He chose a patch of desert between cliffs and the Nile. No temples had stood there before. No gods were worshipped there. It was a blank slate, claimed by priest or tradition. That was the point. Akhenaten wasn't just starting over. He was resetting reality. He would build a city from dust, where only one god, Aten, the sun disk, would be praised. The king would be the sole mediator between heaven and earth. All temples, rituals, and offerings would pass through him. It was a theological revolution and a bureaucratic nightmare. You see, the problem with abandoning an old religion is that it doesn't just affect temples. It affects contracts, land rights, labor systems, storage records, calendars, birth registries, inheritance papers, and someone, likely many someones, had to keep track of it all. That's where the scribe's office came in, buried beneath what we now call the Bureau of Correspondence of Pharaoh, in the central part of Amarna. Archaeologists uncovered an unassuming corner of packed mud brick and decayed plaster, there, just a few inches under a broken floor. They found over 350 clay tablets, each one covered in careful cuneiform. Not hieroglyphs, not Egyptian at all, but Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time. These weren't internal memos, they were foreign correspondence, and they changed how we understood the late Bronze Age. It's a little surreal when you think about it. Here was the city of the most radical pharaoh in Egyptian history, a man who rejected the gods, reshaped state ideology, and rebuilt the calendar around sunlight. And under the floor of one of his most important buildings, we find letters, not about Aten, not about religion, but about grain shortages, marriage, quests, border disputes, diplomatic gifts. It's as if, even as the world was being rewritten above ground, the scribes below had no choice but to keep the wheels turning. Gods may rise and fall, but paperwork continues. What's even stranger is that these letters weren't even Egyptian. They came from Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, Canaan, and other powers of the day. In them, kings addressed Pharaoh as brother. They called Egypt the Great Land. They pleaded, negotiated, and occasionally scolded. One Babylonian king complained about the quality of gold Egypt had sent. Another criticized Pharaoh for failing to send a promised bride. One letter from a Canaanite prince, Abdihiba of Jerusalem, frantically warns that Egyptian vassal lands are under siege by rival warlords, the infamous Habiru, and in nearly every letter, the subtext is the same. Where are you? Why are you silent? It's as if the rest of the world was trying to get Pharaoh's attention, and the scribes, overwhelmed and under orders, kept archiving it all under the floor. The letters aren't just diplomatic curiosities. They reveal a bureaucracy in crisis. Many of them are replies to earlier messages that no longer exist. Others seem to have been copied and never sent. Still others show signs of reworking, with sections scratched out and replaced. And they all have one thing in common. They were found in a collapsed archive, unorganized, without labels, almost as if someone had dropped them in a hurry, or been interrupted before finishing the filing. It raises questions. Was this archive actively used until the city fell? Or was it abandoned earlier, a casualty of shifting priorities, internal tension, or royal indifference? And if so, who was the last scribe to touch them? We know almost nothing about the scribes of Amarna. They appear only occasionally in inscriptions, usually in titles, like Overseer of Royal Correspondence or Chief Scribe of Foreign Lands. But their fingerprints are everywhere. Literally, many of the tablets still bear finger impressions, not just from writing, but from lifting, smoothing, even holding them as they dried in the sun. These weren't clerks in an office with shelves. They were people, working fast, writing in a foreign script, trying to keep Egypt's image intact while the very fabric of its state shifted. Imagine the pressure. Your boss is a divine monarch who believes only he can hear the sun. Your foreign allies are demanding answers. Your vassal states are collapsing, and you're running out of space under the floor. So, you do what scribes always do. You write, you organize, you hide, and then stops. We don't know the exact moment the archive was abandoned, but sometime, perhaps around year 17 of Akhenaten's reign, the city began to change. Walls cracked, temples emptied, workers left, and the floor under the Bureau of Correspondence held its final deposit. Dust settled, sand crept in, clay hardened. Memory slept, and no one returned for centuries. When the site was first excavated in the late 19th century, it was barely a bump in the desert. Diggers had no idea what lay beneath. The tablets, dusty, fragile, and covered in Akkadian, were at first misunderstood. Some were sold to collectors. Others were misfiled. But slowly, piece by piece, scholars began to realize what they had found: a global archive, an ancient diplomatic inbox, a window into the most international period of Egypt's history, preserved not in stone, not in myth, but in routine paperwork. That's the strange magic of Amarna. It was supposed to be a monument to theological purity, a city with no darkness, where the sun shone on every altar, and no god but Aten received praise. But what survived wasn't prayer, it wasn't art, it wasn't even the king. It was a record of complaints, the daily grind of diplomacy, the exhausting maintenance of empire, and the fingerprints of scribes who, for a moment, held the world's anxieties in their hands and quietly pressed them into clay, then buried them, then disappeared. Today, many of the Amarna letters live in museums: Berlin, Cairo, London. Scholars have translated them, cataloged them, even mapped the network of correspondence. And yet, despite all this, the image remains. See, there are still missing tablets, gaps in the narrative, voices that were lost in the dust before they could be copied. What did the scribe under the floor know that we never will? What was the last letter he handled? Did he know, as he placed it among the others, that no one would read it for over 3,000 years? You might imagine a scribe seated cross-legged on a mat, back straight, reed stylus in hand, dipping it into ink to scrawl hieroglyphs onto papyrus. But the scribes of Amarnas, especially those who handled international correspondence, worked differently. They pressed reeds into wet clay, They didn't write in Egyptian at all, okay? And they didn't write for the tombs or temples, but for kings who lived hundreds of miles away. These scribes were diplomats as much as they were writers. They had to know Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the late Bronze Age. Not just the words, but the idioms, the subtleties, the protocols, to interpret nuance, politeness, urgency, flattery, sometimes veiled threats. And they did all this on slabs of clay, shaped quickly by hand, dried in the Egyptian sun. This is where the Amarna letters are unique, not just as documents, but as artifacts of pressure, of workload, of a collapsing diplomatic web, of the quiet panic behind Egypt's sunny revolution. Let's pause for a moment and consider the strange absurdity of it all. Here was a city, Amarna, built not for administration or agriculture, but for devotion. Its temples had no roofs because Atn, the solar disk, needed direct line of sight. There were no dark sanctuaries, no hidden shrines. The rituals were performed in sunlight, not mystery. Yet beneath this theological clarity, the paperwork piled up. Despite Akhenaten's attempt to dissolve the past, international politics didn't go away. And someone still had to manage the inbox, so the scribe's office was built not near the temples, but near the palace, right between grand courtyards and storage houses, surrounded by dust and heat. It wasn't majestic, it wasn't sacred, it was practical, and under its floor, the letters began to accumulate. Not because they were sacred, but because there was no space left above. The archive wasn't meant to be permanent. The clay tablets were stored without much care. Many were found cracked, worn, or incomplete. Some had been stacked together so tightly that they fused. The script Akkadian, cuneiform, was often misshapen or inconsistent. These weren't elegant inscriptions made by native speakers in Babylon. These were Egyptian scribes, probably trained just enough to function. You can see their struggle in the lines, the uncertain wedges, the uneven spacing. These weren't poets or artists. They were overworked, full servants, doing their best in a collapsing system. Imagine sitting on a hard floor in the summer heat. Clay sticking to your fingers as your superior dictates a message to the king of Hatti, who is upset that you haven't responded in 6 months. And now a message from Byblos comes in, warning that pirates are threatening the coast, and Jerusalem wants troops, and Mitanni wants more gold. And you don't have any of it to give. So you write, you translate, you soften, you delay, and when you're done, you place the tablet in the corner, and another, until, eventually, the floor sags with the weight of empire. One of the most fascinating letters comes from a king of Babylon, Amariash. II.N. He complains bitterly about Egypt's failure to honor a diplomatic agreement. Specifically, the gold that Egypt had promised him was of poor quality. It looked fine on the surface, but when examined closely, it turned out to be less than pure. He asks bluntly whether Egypt is trying to deceive him. Now, imagine being the Egyptian scribe who had to respond. You're under pressure to maintain alliances. The Pharaoh is busy with religious reforms. The treasury is strained. Now the sun god doesn't care about metallurgy. So what do you write? How do you apologize without sounding weak? How do you stall without breaking trust? These aren't just historical curiosities. They are moments of human stress, recorded forever in clay dot. Another letter, this one from a Canaanite vassal named Ribahada of Byblos. It's filled with desperation. He sends over 60 letters to the Pharaoh, more than any other known figure. Each one reads like a cry for help. My enemies are many. I have no food. The troops you sent have withdrawn. If the king does not send help, we will perish. Over and over again, Ribahada begs for assistance, and yet, nothing came. We don't know why. Maybe the letters were read, but dismissed. Maybe they were never read at all. Maybe they're still lying somewhere under the ruins of Amarna. Never sent, never answered. It's haunting, because these aren't myths. They're not legends carved onto temple walls. They're pleas from real people, written in a foreign tongue, pressed by tired hands into soft clay, and hidden under a crumbling office floor. One theory suggests that the letters were buried on purpose, maybe as part of an intentional cleanup after Akhenaten's death. When the king died, the city began to unravel. Power shifted, priests returned, old gods were reawakened, and Amarna, a city built for a sun that never set, was left to cool in the dark. In such a moment, bureaucrats might have seen the foreign archive as dangerous, evidence of alliances with the wrong powers, of debts unpaid, of enemies, UNACKNOWLED, too. So they dumped the tablets, not in the river, not in the fire, but under the floor, where they couldn't hurt anyone, but also couldn't be erased. It's the kind of half measure you see in history again and again. Not destruction, just quiet abandonment. The Amarna letters are a treasure, not because of what they say, but because of what they ignore. They never mention the Atan. They never praise Akhenaten's reforms. They don't reflect the religious revolution at all. Instead, they reflect the unchanged mechanics of power, taxes, borders, daughters traded in marriage, gold exchanged for horses, cities besieged by rebels, kings who lie, messengers who vanish, alliances made in ink and undone by hunger, even as the temples of Ammon were being shut, and statues of Aten were being raised. The real world kept pressing in, and the scribes beneath the floor did what scribes have always done. They documented it and hoped someone above would listen. But here's the twist, okay? The people above may not have read them either. Some of the letters, now restored in study, appear never to have been opened. There are signs that they were received, copied, filed, but not replied to, as if the whole Foreign Office had become ceremonial, a theater of diplomacy without policy, or perhaps a forgotten corner of the court, left behind while the king chased his son, God, across the horizon. So the letters piled up, unread, unanswered, until the day the building collapsed and the floor covered them. All centuries passed. Sand and stone did their work. The city vanished from maps. Only locals remembered the strange broken stones in the deserted place they called El Amarna. And then, in the 1880s, a group of peasants digging for fertilizer unearthed a cache of clay tablets. No one recognized them at first. Some were sold to dealers. Others were destroyed. But a few made their way to scholars, and slowly, painstakingly, the truth emerged. These weren't religious texts. They weren't myths or stories. They were letters, the inbox of a forgotten empire, the buried memory of scribes who tried to hold it together, in the whispers of a world that refused to disappear. You might imagine that the Amarna letters, once discovered, would have immediately reshaped our understanding of Egypt's international role during the late Bronze Age. But their reception was slow, hesitant, and fittingly just as tangled as the messages themselves. When they first came to light in the 1880s, the scholars who examined them were baffled. These weren't Egyptian scripts, okay? They weren't found in tombs or temples, okay? Didn't contain invocations of gods or prayers for the afterlife. Instead, they read like memos, like royal emails, written in Akkadian, using cuneiform in Egyptian soil. The letters were passed between museums in Berlin, London, Cairo, and others. Some were lost, others were misfiled. The fragile clay broke easily. Several tablets were never fully translated due to their condition. Even now, over a century later, not every letter has been fully deciphered. The process of unearthing this forgotten diplomatic web, one bureaucratic shard at a time, mirrors the nature of the archive itself. Fragmented, tedious, but astonishingly revealing. If you're patient, and patience is the only way to understand a world, it's built on waiting. We often picture diplomacy as grand formal visits, royal marriages, and monumental oaths. But in the late Bronze Age, diplomacy was a slow, dusty process. Couriers took months to travel between empires. Letters had to be baked carefully and transported without breaking. When they arrived, they had to be translated by scribes, fluent in Akkadian often, not native speakers. Then a reply had to be composed, revised, approved, translated, pressed into clay, dried, and finally dispatched by another long, uncertain journey. No wonder some letters were never answered. The system itself worked at the edge of chaos, relying on consistency in a world full of storms. This is what makes the Amarna letters so quietly powerful. They aren't stories of glory. They are records of maintenance, of keeping relationships alive. Even when the house is crumbling, some of the most evocative letters come from the smallest places. The rulers of minor cities, often little more than fortified towns, wrote as often and urgently as the kings of Babylon or Hatti. One such figure, Abdi-Heba of Jerusalem, sent letter after letter to Pharaoh. His tone is anxious, even desperate. He pleads for soldiers, for archers, for protection. But again and again, there is silence from Amarna. Abdi-Heba tries flattery, then alarm, then frustration. My lord, he writes in one letter, I am your loyal servant. But if help does not come, I will not survive. No record shows whether help ever came. Abdi-Heba disappears from history, not with a rebellion or betrayal, but with a final, unanswered cry. His words, however, survived. Ghent, clay, varied, forgotten, then found a voice from the sand, frozen mid-sentence. It is often the case in history that the minor voices, those on the periphery, give us the clearest view of collapse. The center is silent, but the edges fray loudly in the Amarna letters. We see an empire trying to hold itself together through distant hands. The central government appears distracted. Akhenaten's religious focus seems to have sapped energy from administrative necessities. Even well-established allies complained of inconsistent communication. Some accused Egypt of favoring weaker states or sending impure gold. Others warned that Egyptian vassals were defecting or being conquered by enemy tribes. The Haberusum Times identified with the early Hebrews, sometimes simply as bandits, are mentioned frequently, especially in Canaanite letters. They are presented as a threat, not just to local princes, but to the Egyptian order itself. But there is no evidence that Amarna responded directly. The archive reads increasingly like the inbox of a disengaged ruler. The world outside Amarna burned slowly, while inside, the scribes simply kept archiving the fire. And then, everything stopped. No one knows the precise moment when Amarna began to unravel. But by the end of Akhenaten's reign, the signs were undeniable. Construction ceased. Temples were abandoned. Grain shipments slowed. The Atenist religion, once mandated by the state, began to lose its grip. Akhenaten's successor, perhaps his son, perhaps not, would go on to restore the old gods, and Amarna would be deserted, its buildings stripped for stone, its memory erased from monuments. But the tablets under the floor remained. They were never intended to last, yet they survived the Pharaoh who ignored them, the priests who hated them, and the centuries of desert that followed. In many ways, the scribes won. Who were these scribes? We know so little. Their names don't appear on the letters. Their work was anonymous, like the gears of a machine, but their fingerprints remained clay. The grooves where a palm rested, the drag of a reed stylus, the thumb press at the tablet's corner. One scholar described these tablets as the most human of all. Egyptian records, not because of what they say, but because of how they were made. Imperfect, uneven, rushed. Evidence not of artistic vision, but of daily labor. The scribes of Amarna weren't poets. They weren't priests. They weren't generals. They were mediators between empires, armed with nothing but grammar. And they carried the weight of Egypt's global relationships on their backs until the floor caved in. Imagine the last day of the archive. The building is emptying. The heat is rising. Supplies are low. Letters remain unanswered. Dust creeps into the cracks. Maybe a scribe, loyal to the end, sets down his last tablet. He wipes the sweat from his face. He places the clay in the pile. He looks around at a city no longer shining, at a God no longer praised, and says nothing. He leaves, and the door swings closed behind him. For the last time, the letters sleep. The sand settles, the empire forgets, and for over 3,000 years, no one speaks their names until someone does. When archaeologists uncovered the Amarna letters, they didn't just find a stash of ancient messages. They found a bureaucratic soul, the quiet engine of an empire in a world that often glorifies kings and warriors. The Amarna letters remind us of the unsung diet, the administrators, the translators, the overworked, those whose job wasn't to change history, but to record it, to respond, to smooth over conflict, to buy time. They failed. Of course, the empire unraveled anyway, but their effort, their cleprest determination outlived the policies they tried to uphold. That is the quiet poetry of the archive. It doesn't shout, it endures. Even now, we don't know if we found them all. The full archive was likely larger. Some letters are referenced, but not recovered. Others were probably destroyed before they could be hidden. There may still be tablets buried under the ruins of Amarna's time, waiting for discovery. And if they are found, they will not be glamorous. They will not speak of gods or prophecies. They will speak of grain, of borders, of missed appointments. They will tell us, once again, that history is not shaped only by battles or edicts, but by letters left unread, in the long valley cut between the cliffs of Middle Egypt, where the desert meets the river but avoids the flood. There stands a ghost city. The locals call it El Amarna. But once, long ago, it was called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It was not like Thebes. It was not like Memphis. It did not rise from trade or conquest. It was carved suddenly out of barren earth, like a declaration made in brick. A new capital, ordered into being by a man who believed every temple before him had gotten it wrong. You know this man by many names: Menechotep IV, Akhenaten, heretic king, sun worshipper. But in this story, you might think of him simply as the one who turned the walls inward, because that is what he did. He took the architecture of gods and he reversed it. Not metaphorically, not as poetry. Literally, he had temples built where everything faced the wrong way. In traditional Egyptian temples, walls stand like shoulders. They shelter darkness. The deeper you go, the closer you are to the divine. Statues are hidden in sanctuaries. Processions are linear, from the outer court to the secret inner chamber. It is a world of thresholds, of quiet gradients, of gods hidden in stone recesses. But Akhenaten said no. He said the god did not live in darkness. He lived in the light, not inside walls, but above them, not behind doors, but in the open air. And so, his temples had no roofs. The columns still rose lotus shaped and ceremonial, but nothing shaded them. The sanctuaries had no enclosures. The altars were exposed. Even the offerings, once placed carefully in darkened corners, were now set beneath the burning sun. Everything was reversed. Where once the divine had been veiled, now it was unveiled completely, unceasingly, and without exception. This was not a mere preference in construction. It was a doctrinal act. Architecture became theology. stone became scripture. And every time a wall turned inward, Akhenaten rewrote how Egypt spoke to the gods. There was one central temple in Akhenaten that embodied this reversal more than any other, the great temple of the Aten dot from above. Its layout looks oddly sparse. It doesn't spiral inward like traditional sanctuaries. There are no hidden chapels, no statues in shrines, no long halls of incense. Instead, there are long courtyards, rows upon rows of offering tables, spaces that feel not enclosed, but exposed, and surrounding them walls that don't just enclose the god, they frame the people, too. The walls do not invite entry. They do not funnel pilgrims forward. They circle and turn inward upon the center, a place where the king and his family stand in full sunlight, receiving the rays of the Aten directly. The worshipper in Akhenaten's model did not come to meet the god dot. They came to witness the king meeting the god. It was a hierarchy of radiance. The sun shines on Akhenaten. Akhenaten shines on the people. And the temple holds that vision like a bowl holds water. It's careful not to spill. And so the design becomes a kind of lens. The entire city, in fact, behaves like one massive focusing structure, from the distant cliffs that Akhenaten marked with boundary steely to the central spine of roads, to the positioning of the temples and the windows in the palace. Everything aligns to one truth. The god is visible. The god is always above. There is no need to imagine the divine. You simply look up. No secret hymns, no midnight rituals, just sunlight and the king, always facing it. But here's what's easy to overlook. Most Egyptians didn't live in temples. They didn't follow the architecture. They lived in mud brick houses, narrow and dark, still buried amulets of old gods. They still whispered the names of Amen and Osiris in their sleep. They walked past these inward turned walls on their way to fetch water. They nodded at the sunlight. Yes, but they missed the shadows. It is one thing to proclaim a new theology. It is another to erase the old ones from the bones of the people in one section of the temple's outer enclosure. Archaeologists found strange marks etched into the floor. They weren't part of the formal construction. They weren't official inscriptions. They were scratched into the stone by unknown hands. Circles, marks, names, small, almost desperate, like quiet acts of remembrance. One was an offering basin, drawn where none was built. Another was the faded glyph for Amen, scored with a reed and half ears. Perhaps a priest, perhaps a laborer, someone who once believed differently, and who now lived under a god who had no face, no statue, no voice. They left no protest, no manifesto, just marks dot, as if the silence of the Aten did not fully drown out the whisper of the old gods. And that is the quiet tension at the heart of this story. Akhenaten's temples were not just unusual. They were ENREPEATABA. No one before or after him built them this way. His successors demolished them. His name was erased from king lists. The Aten fell silent again, but for a brief period there stood temples where worship was not hidden, but displayed, where rituals were not enclosed, but exposed, where gods were not imagined through statues, but felt through sunlight. It was a theology of the real, but it may have also been a theology of exhaustion, because if the god is always visible, then the worship never ends. There are no shadows in which to rest, no door to close when belief becomes too heavy. And in the end, that might have been the true flaw of Akhenaten's vision. Not that he erased the past, but that he offered no shelter from his truth. You can still walk through what remains of that temple. The walls are low now, the offering tables shattered, the columns broken, but the sun still hits the same angle. The wind still hums across the stones, and if you stand still long enough, you can imagine how it once was bare feet on limestone, incense lifted into open sky, voices reciting hymns to a God that never hid. And somewhere, deep beneath your feet, someone's fingernail once carved a forgotten name into the floor. In most temples across Egypt, the ceremonies followed a familiar rhythm. The priests would rise before dawn. They would bathe. They would darn linen, never wool. They would walk barefoot along prescribed paths, enter sacred spaces in silence, and awaken the god statue with incense and hymns. The process was not about belief. It was about performance. Each act had weight, not because of emotion, but because it had always been done. Rituals were the grammar of divine relationship, predictable, precise, perfected over centuries. But in the temples of Akhenaten's reign, especially in the great temple of the Aten, this grammar is rewritten entirely. Gone were the dark sanctuaries. Gone were the barks that carried hidden statues through secret corridors. Gone were the hymns to dozens of gods, each with their own calendar and cult in their place. Light, space, openness, and a single name repeated over and over. Aten. The Aten was not a statue. The Aten had no temple image. The Aten had no myth. The god was the sun disk itself, not a symbol of Ra, not an eye of Horus, not a hidden force with animal form, just the sun, circular, shining, radiant, and its ritual, like its temple, was laid bare. In a normal Egyptian temple, only priests and royalty could enter the sacred inner court. In Amarna, even the sanctum, the central offering court of the Aten, was outdoors, without roof or barrier. Rows of offering tables stretched out under open sky. Dozens of them, perhaps even hundreds. Meat, bread, fruits, flowers, wine, all laid out directly to the sun. No god's hand would descend to receive it. No priest's arms would lift it to a statue. The sun received through light alone, and the most important participant was not the crowd, nor even the high priest. It was the king, Akhenaten himself. He was not merely a servant of the god. He was the god's mirror on earth. Wall carvings from Amarna show Akhenaten standing under the Aten's rays, which end in small hand-tiny fingers, offering ang signs, the symbol of life, to the king and queen. Sometimes only the king receives the symbol. Sometimes the queen as well, Nefertiti, whose role in Aten worship was unusually prominent. But never anyone else. No priests, no nobles, no people. This was a closed loop. Son to king, king to god. Even the most sacred daily rituals, once performed by entire tiers of temple priests, were now directed by the royal family. In the scenes, they offer bread, pour libations, burn incense not in hidden chambers, but in full view of heaven. Some scholars believe the ritual calendar itself was simplified. Fewer feast days, fewer local observances, everything centered on the cycle of light. Dawn and dusk became sacred times. The rising sun marked the arrival of the god. The setting sun, its withdrawal. Each morning, the temple was activated again, not with a veil lifted, but with sunlight itself, returning inevitably, gloriously. And yet, there is something curiously exhausting in such clarity, because when every moment is exposed, every gesture becomes performance, and performance, even sacred performance, eventually wears thin. The priests who served in Amarna's temples, if they can even be called priests in the traditional sense, did not tend to statues or maintain secret knowledge. They arranged offerings. They swept open courts. They recited hymns beneath a gaze that never blinked. They were not mediators between the people and the divine. They were servants to a presence that required no mediation, and this left them nowhere to hide. In a normal temple, there is darkness between the columns, cool, shaded mystery. A place to breathe, to pause, to feel the weight of the god without being scorched by it. But here, At Amarna, there was no such refuge. Even prayer became exposed. Even faith became surveillance. And what of the people? Common Egyptians, the potters and bakers and guards and laborers. What did they think of this new mode of worship? There is very little direct evidence, but archaeologists have found small amulets and Amarnine figures of Tauret, the hippopotamus, goddess of childbirth, images of Base, the lion-faced household protector, carvings of Ammon, scratched into domestic walls or hidden in trash pits. These were not Edonist images. They were holdovers, old gods, remembered in secret. It suggests that for many, the old pantheon had not vanished. It had simply gone underground, out in the open. The Aten reigned alone, but behind the door curtain in the dim corners of the home, the old gods still listened. There's a term Egyptologists use for this period, the Amarna interlude. It sounds peaceful, like a musical pause, but in reality, this was a rupture. The temples of Akhenaten did not evolve from earlier forms. They replaced them, suddenly, dramatically. They rejected tradition, even as they mimicked its forms. Columns still rose, courtyards still echoed, but everything pointed inward. Now to one family, one God, one truth. And when Akhenaten died, that rupture snapped shut. The temples were left to crumble. Their open-air courts became ruins. Their offering tables lay bare, scorched by a sun that no longer received its tribute. The people returned to older gods, and the priesthoods of Simon and others resumed their place in the shadowed halls. It was not a revolution. It was a parenthesis, a moment when worship forgot how to whisper, K, and tried instead to stare directly at the source. There is one final irony. Despite Akhenaten's disdain for idols and statues, his own image appears everywhere in Amarna's temples, carved repeatedly on walls, shown embracing his family, kissing his daughters, raising offerings to the Aten. He is not portrayed as a warrior, nor even as a traditional god king. He is thin, with narrow shoulders and an elongated face. He wears no crown of war. He is vulnerable, and it is in this vulnerability, this strange intimacy, that we glimpse something more complex than dogma. Perhaps Akhenaten did not merely want control. Perhaps he wanted clarity. Perhaps he was not trying to silence the past, but to shine through it to worship, not in darkness, but in full exposure, even if it scorched, even if it burned. The temples still sit along the dry bed of the Nile. Bend at Larnag. Few tourists go. There are no towering pylons, no obelisks, no crowds, just foundations, low walls, shattered altars, and silence. But if you arrive in the early morning, just as the light creeps across the stones, you'll notice something. The walls still turn inward. The sunlight still lands exactly where it was meant to. And for a moment, you feel it not belief, perhaps, but understanding that a forgotten ritual, halfway between gesture and faith, etched, not in papyrus, but in the way shadows fall across stone. By the time Akhenaten died, after 17 years of reign, his vision was already unraveling. The city of Akhenaten, once declared eternal, began to empty. The great temple of the Aten, built to face the sun forever, fell quiet. Priests packed up their linen. Officials left half-written records in the sands. Bakers stopped firing their kilns. But it wasn't a dramatic fall. Not fire, not war. It was quieter than that. The kind of silence that seeps in when belief is no longer enough to hold a city together. And beneath that silence was a truth the walls themselves had seen coming. Temples, no matter how radiant, cannot survive on sunlight alone. The last years of Akhenaten's rule are hard to trace. In the reliefs, he appears more elongated than ever, his face thinner, his gestures stiffer. His daughters, once numerous, begin to vanish from the record. Only one or two remain. By the end, the queen, Nefertiti, powerful in earlier inscriptions, seems to disappear entirely from later scenes. Some suggest she died. Others believe she changed her name and quarreled. Still others think she simply fell out of favor, replaced by Akhenaten's mysterious successors, Menkaure, a figure so obscure we're still not sure who he was. But what's more telling than who was left is what stopped appearing. The great hymns to the Aten ceased. The walls stopped being inscribed. Construction slowed, then halted. The bureaucracy, once thick with attendance titles, thinned. The machine was winding down, and all those inward-turned walls, those blank-faced columns open to the sky, stood, waiting without incense, without offerings, without purpose. Amarna was not just a city of temples. It had homes, offices, markets, granaries. It functioned like any capital, housing elites, scribes, and the state apparatus. But unlike Thebes or Memphis, it had no deep roots. It was built in haste, on royal will, with no traditional blessing or ancestral pool. And so, when that will evaporated the royal vision lost its anchor. The people drifted away. Some returned to older cities. Others vanished from record. The houses fell apart, bricks taken for reuse. Kij, the city, dissolved not in blood, but in dust. Even the temples weren't spared. Within decades, the stone was dismantled. Blocks were carted back to Thebes, where they were reused as filler inside other monuments. Ironically, swallowed back into the religious architecture they once rejected. Pieces of Akhenaten's revolution now sit invisibly inside the pylons of Amen temples, his god once celebrated in sunlights, buried in shadow again. One fragment tells the story. It's a cruel elegance. It's a carved block, reused in the foundations of Karnak. On one side, Akhenaten and Nefertiti raise offerings to the Aten. The rays shine down, tiny hands delivering ankh signs to their nostrils. On the reverse, a later pharaoh's name is carved Seti, or Ramesses I of the traditionalists. One side, divine sunlight. The other, erasure. The block, once sacred, now supports another building. A theological revolution now holds up a column to the very gods it tried to replace. History, too, turns its walls inward, but not everything was lost. Beneath the silence of the abandoned temples, beneath the scattered inscriptions and reused stones, something did remain. A memory of what worship looked like when it stepped outside. The open courts, the radiant altars, the king not as conqueror, but as worshiper in light. And though the Aten was officially erased his name, chipped from walls, his hymns left to rot, the experiment itself left a trace, because Akhenaten's temples were never forgotten entirely. They were remembered as oddities, mistakes, heresies, but they were remembered. When later archaeologists uncovered Amarna, they were struck not by its grandeur, had none, but by its tension. Everything had been designed, aligned, composed for exposure. The great temple of the Aten, for instance, wasn't just a religious site. It was a visual diagram. One axis pointed to the rising sun, another to the royal palace. Processional ways linked altars to windows, allowing Akhenaten to observe and be observed. Nothing was hidden, no gesture private. Even the stone used was deliberate local limestone, soft and bright, chosen to reflect sunlight rather than absorb it. The entire city was a theological thesis made visible, and though the thesis failed, the record remains not in glory, in traces, in lines on the ground, in broken altars, too wide for a single god, in courtyards too open to forget. And then there's the final irony. Though Akhenaten tried to erase the old gods, and though later kings erased him in return, it's his experiment that draws modern eyes. Thousands visit Egypt each year to see the temples of Luxor, Karnak, Abu Simbel. But it is Amarna, the city of the god with no face that continues to puzzle, to provoke, to glow faintly with questions we still haven't answered. Why did Akhenaten believe so fully in his son? Why did he open every wall? What did it feel like to kneel in a temple with no roof, knowing the god was not behind a veil, but directly above and blinking, unhidden? And was that exposure sacred or unbearable? You can visit the site today if you wish. It's quiet, few tourists make the journey. There are no grand columns left, just outlines and dust. Foundations where walls once stood, holes where offering tables used to be, but the wind still moves as it did. The sun still rises in the same direction. And if you go early, at dawn, stand in the center of what was once the open court. You may feel it, a warmth on your face, stillness underfoot, a memory not quite yours, of a time when every ritual was public and every wall turned inward to a truth too bright to hold for long, and just for a moment. You might wonder, what would it mean, truly, to live in full view of the divine? And would you want to? Or would you miss the shadows? In a small storeroom beneath the baked foundations of Tel El Amarna. Long after the A10 temples had been abandoned, a set of clay tablets lay quietly beneath the dust. They weren't grand proclamations or royal decrees. They didn't sing praises to the Aton. They didn't mention Akhenaten's name. They didn't mention any gods at all. They were lists, inventories, line after line of tiny, wedge-shaped marks scratched into clay, methodical, dry, even dull. And yet, strange, they listed no divine names. They recorded no ritual terms. But they hinted at a moment in Egyptian history when everything known about worship, about memory, about survival, had to be rewritten in silence. This was not the story of a grand temple. It was the story of its end and what its last stewards chose to leave behind when Akhenaten died. The empire did not end immediately. The city of Akhenaten did not fall in a single season. But decay had already crept in. Food supplies thinned. The Nile had shifted in its usual stubborn rhythm, disrupting the agricultural cycles. Foreign envoys, once received with fanfare and gifts, were left waiting. Outposts in Syria and Canaan sent desperate tablets requesting gold, caged soldiers, and received silence. Back in Akhenaten, the state bureaucracy, trained in the new rites of Atonism, carried on as best it could. They still tallied grain. They still managed workshops. They still issued labor rations, recorded death notices, maintained the paperwork of a fading god. But something had shifted. The words were becoming careful in certain names. Names once declared in every prayer began to vanish from the records. Cache of clay tablets uncovered in the 20th century near the temple storehouses revealed something curious. Among the fragments were standard economic records, lists of loaves, jugs of beer, linen rolls issued to workers. But where one might expect a temple's name or a god's, there was nothing. Instead, house of the sunlight, upper storehouse of the light, table room, east entry of rotten, never Akhenaten, never any deity, and on the rare occasion when an old priestly title appeared, like servant of the daily offering, it was followed by a gap, an omission. The line would trail off, as if to say, I will tell you what I do, but not whom I do it for. These weren't mistakes. They were deliberate silences, and they tell us something rare in history, not just what a people believed, but what they chose not to record. Imagine a scribe seated in the shadow of a collapsing order. He has seen the statues of the royal family defaced. He has heard rumors that Amon's temples in Thebes are rising again, that priests with old titles are reclaiming their power. He knows the tablets, he writes, may outlive him, and he chooses not to name the Aten. He chooses not to burn the lists, either. He does not make speeches. He does not resist. he simply continues. The ledgers, just with the proper nouns erased. This quiet erasure is a form of protest, more powerful than defiance. It is administrative forgetting, and yet the records were preserved, so the silence itself was kept. Why? There is one tablet, less complete than the others, that stands out among the Amarna archive. It appears to be a master inventory, not of offerings or supplies, but of stored materials. Chests of papyri, stone stelae, bundles of ritual tools, sealed crates for the interior room. Unlike other records, this one includes marginal notes, short markings. It's probably made by different hands. One says, to be destroyed. Another says, hold until instructed. A third, next to a line about read cases of hymns, do not burn, sent from the queen, Cain. It's unclear which queen. Nefertiti, a successor. We don't know, but someone high enough to send instructions to a temple scribe had decided that some words were worth saving, even as their god was being erased. And so this section of history narrows to a small circle of people, final priests, final scribes, final stewards of a theology collapsing in on itself. Not all of them were loyal. Some likely defected early, quietly resuming older traditions. But a few, just a few, seem to have continued, maintaining the atoned temples not out of zeal, but out of duty. They didn't worship, necessarily. They managed, they kept the oil, jars full. They swept the empty offering tables. They cataloged the items awaiting their unknown fate. And when the time came, when orders came down from the new regime to abandon the city, they chose not to destroy everything. They left these records, not to be read, perhaps, but not to be forgotten. A final, haunting detail. One tablet includes a list of unused temple items. Among them, wooden sunshade panels, granite ring base without column, and, strangely, its ivory writing box, unopened. No contents listed, no owner noted, no god named. Just that, unopened. Was it ever opened? Did someone take it? Does it still lie, buried in a sealed room beneath the drifting sands, the ink inside never touched by light? We don't know, but in that untouched box, in that last act of inventory without worship, cues the silence of the Amarna priests, echoes louder than any hymn, and that silence still waits beneath floors. No one enters. Hind walls turned inward. Inside archives that named no gods, and yet remembered everything. You might imagine that when a city dies, it does so noisily, with the clatter of feet leaving, the groan of doors closing, or the fire of pillage. But in the case of Akhenaten, the city that Akhenaten built in his own image, its last moments were a slow, paper-thin unraveling, one ledger at a time. The sun still rose over the colonnades. The wind still combed through the narrow alleys, but the echo changed. It became too large for the city. And in that growing space of silence, a strange kind of loyalty began to surface. Not to the king, not to the god, but to the records themselves. Most of what we know about the last months of Akhenaten comes not from royal decrees or dramatic monuments, but from the mundane writings, the ledgers, the receipts, the allocations of bread to temple servants, and oil to the keepers of storerooms, the kinds of notes people write when they still believe someone will read them later. The bureaucrats of Akhenaten, trained in the specific style of the Atenist administration, were not just scribes, they were guardians of process. And though the ideology above them had begun to crack, the procedures had not. Bread still had to be counted. Jars still had to be sealed. Storage rooms still had to be inventoried, even if their contents would never be used again. And so, in the shadow of the temples, in rooms barely tall enough to stand, men with reed pens and clay tablets carried on, not out of faith, but out of inertia, or perhaps out of something more human, the fear that if they stopped writing, their world would cease to exist. The most puzzling thing about the godless inventories, as some archaeologists call them, is not just what they list, but how calmly they record the slow disassembly of a world. They note when rooms are excluent. One, when rooms are sealed. They record when statues are removed. King. To where they describe the weight of stone altars, the length of bronze staffs. K. And even the condition of ceremonial sandals left behind by a high priest whose name had already been scratched from his own doorway. No poetry, no lamentation, just facts. One entry notes, copper basin, fractured, at rim, not used. Another, reed mats from upper hall, faded, rolled, do not allocate. They read like the final breaths of a building that once thought itself eternal. Among these records, one room is mentioned repeatedly. It is never named directly. Instead, it is referred to with coded phrases. The cooled room, room beyond the storage court, the place beneath the place. Its contents are vague, always wrapped, never described. One line lists objects with sealed ends, untouched. Another, records to be weighed, not opened. The recurring instruction next to every mention of this room is just one word. Retain what was in that room? We can't know. The chamber has never been found, or if it has, no one has said. Some believe it was the central archive of the Athenus temple, the core of Akhenaten's rewritten theology, stored on perishable papyrus. Others argue it was simply a forgotten storeroom, labeled over time. But those who've studied the tablets agree. The scribes who stayed behind knew it mattered, and they refused to destroy it. Egypt had no paper shredders to erase something properly. It had to be unrolled, unwrapped, read aloud, then ritually burned, ashes swept, ink rinsed, names scraped from stone. But in Akhenaten, there were too many records, too many lists, too many crates marked with ambiguous phrases and double seals. The effort to destroy would have required a kind of violence the scribes simply did not possess. And so they chose a different kind of forgetting, burial by bureaucracy. They sealed the doors, they stacked the boxes, they marked the ledgers, and they left. But not all of them. One clay tablet, found near the base of the great temple, buried beneath a broken brick wall, appears to be a personal note, unfiled, unmarked, perhaps never meant to be read. Its text is fragmented, but what survives is haunting. I was told to erase the names, but I remember them. I was told to burn the songs, but I still hear them. I was told to leave, but I wrote this instead. No name signs it. No date marks its corner. It was found near the shattered remains of an oil lamp and a reed stylus, both burnt. Perhaps it was the last thing ever written in the city. Perhaps not. But the voice it carries, quiet, signed, persistent, lingers. There's another mystery tied to these inventories, the complete absence of transition. Nowhere in the records is there mention of a new god. Nowhere is Amen invoked. No return is noted. No revolt described. The scribes did not pivot. They did not betray their 10 by naming another. They simply stopped naming at all. It is as though they understood that the theological experiment was ending, not with fire, with stillness, up, blank space. The inventories became their final act of worship, not to a god, but to memory, and in that space, they preserved something even more sacred than doctrine, the quiet dignity of the last ones left in modern archives. The godless inventories are classified by region and storeroom, filed alongside architectural maps of Akhenaten, but none of them offer conclusions. Instead, they read like trails that end just before the answer. How many were written? We don't know. How many were destroyed? Even less clear. But the ones that remain, hundreds of lines scratched into clay and tucked into forgotten corners, survive not because they were important, but because they were unimportant enough to be left alone. That's what makes them powerful. They weren't meant to explain anything. They just refused to spear, and so they remained in silence. In the end, it's not the grand statues of Akhenaten, the toppled pillars of the Aten temples that hold the deepest clues. It's the lists, the objects, the refusals in the middle of a failed utopia. As theology was being rewritten and then erased, a few final hands recorded everything they could, except the one thing they were told to remember. And by leaving that part blank, they told us more than any inscription could. What will we one day refuse to name? Hint, who will read our ledgers when we are gone? In the last years of Akhenaten, when the sun no longer rose to trumpet hymns, and no courtiers knelt in courtyards of light, the people left quietly, not with war, not with fire, but with silence. The royal family had gone, the army had withdrawn, the worshippers of Amen were returning to Thebes, and the city that had once been the epicenter of an experimental faith was now nothing but wind through pylons, sand in the joints of broken doors, and the occasional scuttle of animals nesting in empty houses. But beneath it all, under layers of dirt, time, and erasure, the record keepers had left something behind. Not monuments, not prophecy, but a complete, methodical, quietly defiant list of everything that had once mattered, and the God it never named. It began with a box, not a grand one. A small ivory case found buried under what appeared to be a scribe's storeroom, alongside broken writing palettes and beads of faded pigment. The box had no decoration, no inscription. Inside were tablets, tiny ones, barely a few centimeters across. Some had impressions of sealed documents, clay that once enclosed papyrus scrolls, now lost to rot. Others had full texts in delicate lines of Akkadian cuneiform, international correspondence from distant lands. But the real mystery was in the smallest slab. It bore a title, items retained by order. Handwriting was different, tighter, less ceremonial. The language was Middle Egyptian, not formal hieratic. Listed objects, obscure ones, shadows of the court, possibly veils or decorative screens, circles of white stone, closed, sky measure, reversed. Lips of God, unspeaking. These were not metaphors. This was inventory, and yet the names made no sense unless they were coded, unless someone was trying to preserve something without drawing attention to it. Cross-referencing these phrases with the better-known temple stock lists from Akhenaten, scholars found faint parallels. Shadows of the court may have referred to sheer fabric panels used to cast patterns of sunlight inside the Aten sanctuaries. Circles of white stone might have been alabaster offering dishes, deliberately turned upside down as a sign of disuse. Sky measure, reversed, could imply a sundial or water clock, stored or destroyed. Lips of God, unspeaking. Perhaps ritual masks or statues with sealed mouths. These weren't just items. They were symbols of a theology, being unmade, and yet someone had cataloged them carefully without once naming Aten, Akhenaten, or the priests who handled them. The person who wrote this knew exactly what they were doing. Not long after this box was uncovered, archaeologists began re-examining lesser-known storage rooms in Akhenaten. Most had been dismissed. Plain, undecorated spaces carved into the bedrock beneath temple platforms or adjacent to servant quarters. But one in particular drew attention. It had no entrance, just a wall, uniform, flat, with no seams or decoration, but a shallow depression in the floor. Nearby indicated that something had once been moved frequently in and out of that spot. A heavy object on a sled, perhaps. There was no door, yet signs of passage. A wall that might be hiding a room. When the wall was gently cleared of debris and scanned, a cavity behind it was confirmed. A sealed chamber, untouched since the abandonment of the city inside. No one knows, because the chamber as of this writing, remains unopened. Egyptian authorities, cautious, protective of Akhenaten's legacy and the fragile politics surrounding it, have postponed excavation, and so the chamber sits beneath the temple platform, behind a plain stone wall, unseen, unentered, but perhaps still holding what the final priests refuse to destroy. Perhaps even the last true inventory, written not in clay, but in silence. What would such a room contain? Not gold, not royal sarcophagi. That was never the Atenist way. Instead, perhaps rows of reed baskets, faded, brittle, bound with plant cord, perhaps hundreds of papyrus rolls, records of hymn compositions, grain allocations, labor shifts, legal decisions under the Atenist regime, or perhaps ceremonial items, offering tables deliberately overturned, stone jars marked not with God's names, but numbers, even fragments of broken sun discs shattered, symbols of the light that had once ruled Egypt and was now best forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, one final set of tablets, the last entries in the inventory, the ones meant for no eyes, the ones not even the scribes could bear to sign. But let's return to the documents we do have, because sometimes absence tells us more than presence. The final tablets from Akhenaten contain curious features, long horizontal scratches drawn across the center of the clay, as if the writer was striking out a name or ending a sentence halfway through. Some scholars believe this was an act of purification, canceling the content ritually, while still preserving the record of its existence. Others suggest it was a sign of censorship, the scribes obeying orders to write, pay, and in the margins of some tablets, faint impressions of fingers, thumbprints, pressed into drying clay, personal marks, not signatures, just reminders that someone was there. And this brings us to the final layer, the human. The last people in Akhenaten were not radicals. They were not kings or prophets. They were clerks, cooks, sweepers, priests whose gods were gone, scribes whose pens outlasted their purpose. They watched the statues come down. They heard the rumors of Thebes rising again. They saw the caravans stop arriving. And still, they walked the corridors of the temples and storerooms. Still, they swept the floors. Still, they checked the inventory, and when the final orders came to abandon the city, to erase its name, some obeyed, but some recorded silently, anonymously, deliberately. It is tempting to imagine. One final act, a single priest returning to the sealed room, carrying a lamp, roll of papyrus, a soft cloth to wrap the last fragments. He kneels before the wall, places the items inside rolls, the papyrus tight, marks it with nothing but a reed stroke. He seals the chamber. He turns and he walks into history, leaving behind the one room no one will enter, a room named in no records, and yet present in every silence, in modern archives, tucked away in glass cases and photographed on digitized plates. The godless inventories remain unassuming, simple, utterly ordinary, and yet they may be the most honest artifacts we have, because they ask no one to believe. They ask only to be remembered. So, what happens if the sealed room is opened one day? Will we find a revelation, or simply boxes of broken things? Does it matter? Perhaps not. Perhaps the point was never the objects. Perhaps it was the silence around them, the decision not to burn, not to name, not to lie. That silence, etched into clay and left beneath stone, speaks louder than any proclamation. And maybe the last inventory was never written at all. Maybe was lived by those who refused to forget without ever saying a word. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Good night. Dot 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 dot.